Charles Lister is a senior fellow and director of the Counterterrorism of Extremism program at the Middle East Institute. Charles, why is this a catastrophe? What happens when Turkey invades that part of Syria?
Well, I think at the outset, we have to acknowledge that we've spent the past 5 years a large amount of money, 11,000 Kurdish and Arab lives, and a huge amount of sort of energy and thinking to roll back ISIS's territorial caliphate. We're at the most critical moment right now, whereby we can turn a tactical victory into a strategic one. So to consider a departure in any nature, any environment right now is short-sighted and wrong-footed. But to consider it in such a way as a Turkish cross-border incursion becomes an inevitable eventuality, that almost inevitably sets off a ethnic and potentially a sectarian conflict in northern and eastern Syria. It's going to provide groups like ISIS every opportunity they could wish for to stage a comeback, and the comeback that we've all feared all along.
But why is that? I mean, because the Kurdish fighters will be otherwise occupied. And by the way, reminding our viewers, they are guarding 60, 70,000 ISIS prisoners in some parts of Syria. Even if it's not in the zone that Turkey invades, you know, they will have to kind of turn their attention elsewhere. And it could mean that these ISIS fighters who've been trying to regroup in some of these camps and prisons will have the opportunity to do so. So this will hurt the United States ultimately.
100%. The prisoners are a huge issue. There's also over 100,000 IDPs, most of whom were family members of ISIS over the last 5 years, who are also in camps, who stand to be largely insecured, not to mention the foreign fighters, which is, of course, a huge issue. But ISIS is, I mean, the clear fact here is ISIS is already staging a comeback in parts of Syria under which we're in control. So to consider departing now in a circumstance that will create chaos and instability creates the conditions whereby groups like ISIS thrive. Just look at Iraq over the last 5 years, look at Syria over the last 5 years. Chaos is exactly what allowed ISIS to grow in the first place. Their philosophy is based on an idea of managing chaos and savagery. So an ethnic conflict that will result from a Turkish incursion is a dream scenario. It's everything ISIS could wish for at exactly this point at time.
And who are the other, not winners, but beneficiaries of this situation? Because I'm sure Assad is quite happy about this development, Iran, potentially, Russia as well.
That's exactly it. I mean, the immediate winners are Turkey, at least in the short term, as far as their domestic politics are concerned, and their immediate national security interests. Medium term is ISIS, and then long term, yes. The fact of the matter is, if chaos reigns in northeastern and eastern Syria over the next months and potentially years, that will provide the opportunity for Damascus, the Assad regime, and its big two backers, Russia and Iran, to step in and at some point offer a deal, either or both, to Turkey and the SDF, to the Kurds, which inevitably will mean some kind of what they call a restoration of sovereignty, of sovereign control over that 30% of Syria. So in a way, just as people criticized Trump for cutting aid to the vetted opposition a couple years ago, this is just as much of a strategic victory for the regime alliance, in that it weakens their most significant competitor or rival.
But then it is remarkable to frame it in that way, right? That the United States is doing precisely what would benefit its enemies and precisely what would go against its own self-interest with regards to terrorism and ISIS.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks volumes, frankly, not to get too political about it, but it speaks volumes about Trump's inability to manage an effective foreign policy. You can look at the Gulf, you can look at North Korea, you can look at a whole variety of issues around the world. And just as the congressionally mandated Syria study group released their report just a short while ago, there was a line in there which said, at every second that the US has gained leverage in Syria, sometime soon thereafter, it's given it away. And this is probably the biggest example of that.
Why?
Because for domestic political reasons, I think Donald Trump's primary focus here is getting re-elected in 2020. There's obviously an impeachment inquiry at the moment, so it's a great time to distract attention. But Donald Trump got elected on not being involved in wars, particularly in the Middle East. He made that clear in his recent tweets.
I mean, when you're in the U.S., nobody's really talking about soldiers in Syria. I don't think the average American knows that there are about 1,000 soldiers in Syria. I mean, it seems to me if this were a political argument that he's making to be reelected, it would be a strange one at this stage, right? Because even in that zone that the U.S. is withdrawing from to allow this Turkish invasion, we're talking a few hundred, I think, at most, right?
Yes, exactly. And to those of us who are well informed on this issue, that is the exactly legitimate argument to make. I've written it, I've said it many times as well as many others have. But the fact of the matter is, if Donald Trump gets up on an electoral stage and says, I've withdrawn from Syria, I've stopped our involvement in another forever war, he will win votes. For many Americans, it doesn't matter whether we have hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands. The fact of the matter is we're involved in a war in Syria. Now, I and you and many others will say this is a catastrophe. This is an extraordinarily short-sighted policy decision. But for Donald Trump, it's just one more thing to tick off on his list to his voting base in America. And frankly speaking, we may not see the most damaging consequences of this for several more years, and at which point getting re-elected won't matter anymore. I do, unfortunately, think it's as simple as that for our president.
Charles Lister, thanks so much. Pleasure having you on the program on this important day.
Thank you.